Those who live in / near the Appalachians, what strange / creepy / scary experiences have you had? By deleted.
Lindsay1 says, my family moved to the deep south from California and bought a house about an hour outside a medium city. Somewhat rural, but not too bad. The first night we spent in the house, my mom awoke to a terrible and strange noise that scared her absolutely shitless. She had never heard such a sound growing up in Southern California, and she had a difficult time describing it to me the next morning. Her bedroom window looks out over the front porch and the lights were off, so she didn't see anything. A few nights later, she wakes me up in the middle of the night and hurriedly tells me to come to her room. She hears the noise again. So I go to her room and sure enough, I can heard it. And it sounded like a freaking alien right outside her window. We go over to the light switch panels for the porch lights and flick them on. It was a turkey.
Branches says, geez, I could probably fill this entire thread with stories. Used to joyride on back roads and drink a few beers act. One time this gated Forest Service road was opened where it is normally locked. This road lead 10 miles into a place called Ramsey's Draft, which is also near a place called the Confederate Breastworks where they used to make and store ammo during the Civil War. Anyway, we drive down this road and it eventually dead ends in a heavily wooded valley. There is a trailhead there into the draft, so we hop out of the truck and walk out to piss and drink a beer, act. Immediately me and my two buddies get a feeling something is off about this place. Felt like someone was watching us, so we did what any logical dumbasses would do and we split up to look around. I was about 100 yards from the truck and I stumbled upon a campfire that was recently smothered out, like a few minutes ago. Next to the fire was a wooden stake in the ground and resting on top of that stake was a fucking lit cigarette. I about shit myself, to be honest. I pulled my pistol out and quickly, but not in a panicked way, made my way back to the truck where I found my buddies also with pistols drawn, whispering, we need to get the fuck out of here right now. And we did that and I've never been back. Not long after this happened, a man went missing from the Confederate Breastworks and Ramsey's Draft area. The story goes he was confronted by some people while hiking and was told to never come back, but for some reason he went back the next day because he left his cell phone or something, never was seen again. His name was Robert Fitzgerald. We think people were cooking meth back in there, or perhaps Irish travelers were hiding out in the woods as they were recently on the run for crimes in WV around that time. I got loads of stories. Those mountains got some weird folks in them.
DarrenEdwards says, I was staying a great uncle for a few weeks in Kentucky. I went down the wrong road and got lost. I drove around and around. Finally I pulled over to ask for directions. The guy was young, but had a smile like Stonehenge. You best'n not go down that road, lessen you got kinfolk down there. I listened and backtracked. It was an area that was known to shoot at census workers.
Dire_Cakes says, I grew up in a deep holler of WV, dirt roads, wood stoves, etc. When I graduated high school I went to college in Huntington and was telling a few classmates, friends, about how some places had me electric and such. Well, they decided to come stay with my family and I during a break for like a week. Well, I drive them there and on a dirt road to my grandparents live. A bunch of my old friends from high school come flying and swerving around us covered in mud. My newer friends were mortified. Well, talked to them a bit and told my friends about muddy lol. We get to my grandparents at sundown and my grandma is making dinner and my grandpa is telling them some folktales he's heard, getting them creeped out. Well, we eat dinner and are all sitting in the living room just talking and we hear this loud ear-splitting scream from outside, maybe 50 yards or so, and it's pitch black out. One of my friends goes white and the other two stand up and go to run out the door cause it sounds like women are just outside screaming. My grandpa puts his arm out and in all seriousness looks at them and says that ain't no woman out there, boys, to which my grandma, who looks like a sweet plump little old lady, pipes in, "Hess right, if you go running out there I'm afraid you won't be making it back. That's the wampus cat trying to get you to come out so she can rip you up." These three decently built men didn't sleep a wink that night and my grandparents and I still laugh about it to this day.
Sunghooter says, my girlfriend at the time and I went camping out in the backwoods of Greenbrier County, West Virginia. We were both 18 years old and drove about 5 hours to get to the camping spot to stay Friday to Sunday. Friday afternoon we arrive and make camp. I put up the tent and we took a short hike and then I built a fire and we settled in for the night. No issues so far. Saturday morning we wake up and get ready for a day of adventuring. We were busy walking miles and miles and we ran into two different sets of people who were also camping fairly close to where we were. Eventually the sun surrenders to darkness and out in this area, nighttime is super dark. We have lanterns and flashlights but no major issues except for a few mosquitoes. Shortly after around 1 a.m. we turned in for the night, zipped up the tent, and we were both out pretty quick after a day full of activity. I'm a very light sleeper and it didn't feel like very long after I fell asleep I heard a soft rustling sound. Whatever was making the noise, it sounded like it was about 20 yards away from the tent. I looked over at my girlfriend. Sound asleep. Why can't I sleep like that? I figured that the soft rustling sound was a small animal or something else minor and tried to go back to sleep. Then the soft rustling sound stopped. Then suddenly in the silence of the night, I heard a thud sound that sounded like a decent-sized piece of wood falling onto the forest floor from a couple feet high coming from the same direction the soft rustling sound came from. Again my girlfriend didn't hear anything and was still asleep. I had to pee anyway so I began to unzip the tent and my girlfriend slightly woke up and rolled over asking where you going? Not wanting to worry her, I just told her I had to pee. Then grabbed a flashlight and crawled out of the tent immediately shining the light in the direction the sound was coming from. There was nothing. Just trees, bushes, and total darkness that seemed as if it was swallowing up the beam of my flashlight. I walked around the edge of the campsite looking for anything out of the ordinary but just as I was about to give up, the flashlight beam caught two reflections out in the dark. They were eyes and they were looking back at me. I stood there with the flashlight beam locked on the eyes. They appeared low to the ground and didn't seem to be moving but after a few seconds, the 2 points of light moved to reveal it was nothing but a bunny. I laughed at myself, answered nature's call, and returned to the tent laughing at myself. I settled back into my sleeping bag trying to fall asleep and I was almost there when out of nowhere I heard a very loud noise that seemed to be coming from only a few feet from the tent. It sounded like a heavy animal's footstep like the footsteps of the T-Rex from Jurassic Park. I sat up waiting to hear more sounds while images of what could possibly be making these noises in the middle of the night flashed through my head. I remained awake for another hour and a half or so until I finally fell asleep for the night. In the morning, some of those nearby campers we had met the day before walked up to our campsite asking if we had heard or seen anything the night before. My girlfriend began to reply no we didn't, before I interrupted her and said that I had heard some strange noises. The other campers ran into a wildlife officer who had told them to be on alert because a bear had been spotted in the vicinity.
Dater5105 says, after moving to West Virginia and driving around some backroads, talking backroads where there are no power lines yet people live out there, to check out the area, had a dog run in front of the car with something in his mouth. Couldn't figure out what it was so we slowed down a bit to check it out as we passed the dog. It was a hand, a legit severed human hand in his mouth. Needless to say we turned around and never went down that area again.
Brancher says, another one, more strange and funny than scary though. There used to be this big party back in the woods at the end of the school year. Like everybody would go camp a few days and get fucked up. It was pretty fun generally. Me and a few buddies went up to camp one night and we were drinking all day and about ran out of beer so one buddy decides he's going to drive drunk into Brandywine, nearest town, and get a case of beer for us because he was the only one with a fake. So he drives out of the Forest Service road and comes around a corner and he basically runs a cop off the road who was coming the other direction. Anyway he got pulled over and got a DUI. $500 fine and WVBTW. So me and my other buddy who were sober, decided we'd go bail him out of jail so we drive up to Franklin which is the closest town with a jail cell and they don't even make us pay bail, they just let him out and tell him to have a good one. So we get our buddy who just got the DUI to buy the beer and we head back to the party. When we get to the party the cops that arrested my buddy were there, drinking with the kids. The cop that arrested him came over and drank with us and said he wouldn't have even given him a DUI if he hadn't run him off the road. Okay, good to know officer. Later that night the cops brought out boxing gloves and got kids at the party to fight them in Street Fighter-style ring of people. It was insane. Also, if you wandered off across the road in the wrong spot, you were trespassing on a secret military base and you'd get swooped up and not be seen for a while.
Ilunibi says, Southeast Kentucky. It's where the bulk of my family lives, except I have a cousin who grew up elsewhere with my uncle who has money and lives a bit better than most of his kin. My cousin is an artsy guy who was brought up with stories from his dad about the area, and it gave him a very romanticized idea of mountain life. He used to visit a lot as a kid, so he associated the mountains with family and fun and not the crazies I grew up with some 20 years later. Well, he comes in to visit and has this idea that he's going to go visit and photograph this place called Rebel Rock. His dad has talked it up some, and so it had to be important, right? He just kind of gathered me and my aunt and his wife up and said he knew where to find it, and we were off. I was maybe 16 or 17 at the time, and I realized as we were driving that my aunt was getting noticeably uncomfortable and I couldn't understand why. Took me a bit to realize that after we'd got back on this back road on the way to Rebel Rock, we were driving past sign after sign that said no trespassing. At some point I brought it up and my cousin just waves it off as no big deal. Rebel Rock is a landmark, right? His dad visited it, so it must be open to the public. We finally get to this rock, which is right on the side of the road, and it's trashed. My cousin decides to walk further into the woods and leave the rest of us standing outside the car while he's trying to find an angle not covered in beer bottles and graffiti. While we're standing there, I realize that Terry's words spray painted on the asphalt right in front of where he parked. We can see you. So, I freak out. And my aunt comes over and looks at it and laughs. This is how horror movies start. And that's when we see a glint of light across from us. The way we were parked where Rebel Rock is, we were near the edge of the mountain and directly across from another cliff. And, if you squinted, you could see light shining off glass across from us. It's a fucking scope. They were using it like binoculars. We also see movement, meaning somebody is over there. Suddenly, everyone is yelling at my cousin that we need to go. Now. He has the keys, he dragged us up there, we are there basically as his prisoners, we are trespassing, and somebody saw us. And trespassing in the mountains is not a good idea. You may get some irritated old lady. You could get somebody cooking meth. You're equally likely to get shot. This was a bad idea all around. Of course, Hess not listening. He says we're being paranoid. Or, at the very least, just one more shot and we can go. At this point, we hear a truck coming down the road from further up the mountain, and every last one of us is hoping we found a reasonable bunch. And then comes this pickup, full of folks. They're in the cab, in the bed. It's like they formed a posse just to get us. And they are pissed. Confused. But pissed. They start grilling my aunt about what we're doing, and before we can answer, here comes my cousin. They seem even more baffled when they see this city boy with his fancy camera, and my cousin flawlessly integrates himself into speak. Thankfully, they were nice enough people. Once they realized my cousin was there just to take photos, they dropped the anger and just were picking on him about not listening to the no trespassing signs. Turns out they just monitor Rebel Rock pretty intently because teenagers and younger folks like to come out there and party, drink, do drugs, and trash the place, which is super frustrating for them. Not to mention pricey when they have to have the garbage hauled away. They were baffled when they got to us, and it was one teen, some middle-aged women, and some dude with a camera. They let us off the hook and my cousin got his pictures, so it ended well in the end, but Christ. Just the realization you're being watched in the middle of the woods and just hearing that noisy ass truck slowly making its way to us was absolutely horrifying.
Opening Good One says, I grew up in upstate SC, which is at the base of Appalachia. My family has many wonderful stories. My family has stories of folks talking the fire out of burns and the blood out of cuts. My family owns a construction company. Once a young boy fell on one of their jobs. They were worried because the boy's cut wouldn't start bleeding. His mother came out and she called to another child to call her mother. When the grandmother arrived, She whispered over the cut and suddenly the bleeding completely stopped and the cut looked like it was on the way to being healed. The mother explained that her mother could talk the blood out of cuts. According to the lore, if someone tells another person how to do it, then they can't do it anymore. So it's only shared through deathbed confessions. My father didn't believe it until he saw it with his own eyes. Also, there's a family story that has been passed down for around 100 years. Once my great-uncles were out hunting. I literally knew some of them growing up and they were all honest lucid individuals. They saw an animal that was a sort of chimera. It looked like a deer but had a tiny human head. It leapt on a fence post and then ran into the woods. Their hunting dogs ran after it and they were never seen again. We also have several ghost stories but I don't want to go on too long. Let me know if you're interested.
153,799 says, I was traveling down south and stopped in a little town that anyone from the north going to the south knows, right on the West Virginia/North Carolina state lines. I was staying at a Ramada there, just outside of the town. It's the typical strip of hotels, motels and a truck stop right off the freeway. I decided to go stretch my legs and walked behind the motel where there was a big field with the freeway just beyond. The sun had just set so the sky still had that light that makes light-colored things glow a little. I don't know why I went back there, especially alone, but as I was standing there, I started feeling uneasy. Then I thought I saw something out of the corner of my eye, in the field. I looked hard and could barely make out something white. I knew there were a lot of feral kittens around and thought it might be that. Just as I started to realize this was just a bad idea, the little white thing became big and was moving at speed in my direction. I sprinted down the parking lot and towards the office without slowing to look behind me. I knew whatever it was still coming by the looks on the faces of the people unloading their cars for the night as I was running past. Suddenly I heard a scrape, a scream and a splat. When I turned around, there was a scrawny woman splayed out on the sidewalk, matted hair with dried fresh blood on her face. She was screeching like a banshee. Someone had tripped her, not knowing what was going on. Long story short, she was in the field after getting dirty with a truck driver in exchange for meth. He punched her a few times. She stabbed him, minor injury because he went back to his rig and drove away but later turned up in a hospital in NC. I switched to a different hotel for the night and when I returned home, I took a concealed carry class got license and a little buddy which now goes where I go, especially when I'm standing behind sketchy Appalachian hotels near truck stops in the dark.
Rad_influence says, when I was living in rural Appalachia a handful of years ago, I had someone, or multiple people, repeatedly harass me at night for over a year. I never found out who it was, but it might have been either an old friend of my grandfather's who was growing weed near my house or possibly one of the people from down the mountain who used to dirt bike through the forest in the evening. At the time, I would walk through the neighborhood, which is less a proper neighborhood and more along the lines of 20 houses spread over a half-mile patch of dirt road, and sounding forest if I couldn't sleep. One night during my usual rounds, I began feeling as though something was watching me. I had seen wild animals during my walks before, including a bear which, side note, was horrifying, so I decided to trust my instincts and get back to my house as calmly but quickly as possible. The eerie feeling of being stalked followed me all the way to my house. I admittedly was a bit too afraid to really listen for the footsteps of whatever was following me. I was 19/20, so the logic of if I don't hear it, it isn't real totally made sense to me. I got back to my house safely, and went to bed that night sure that, were I to search the woods the following morning, I wasn't going to find any trace of what had been tracking me. Unfortunately, I was wrong. When I searched the woods the next day, I found a used condom right at the tree line beside my house. After that incident, I began hearing knocking on the wall nearest the tree line, tapping on the windows, and the sounds of people speaking. I did convince my mother to go check it out a few times, but whoever it was would already be loudly running back through the forest by the time she got around the house. Things got so bad that I was eventually, after months of dealing with these nightly occurrences and my grandparents refusing to let me do anything about it, able to convince my uncle, who lived nearby, to put up a security camera. Unfortunately, it was the kind that only displayed a live feed and he had it facing my front door instead of the woods. If you're wondering, I absolutely thought this entire setup was sketchy. He also insisted on monitoring from his house, and he insisted that he never saw anyone on camera. It was around this time that someone also sliced through the fabric cover on my grill and stole a storage crate full of my old clothing from inside a shed. Once the batters in the camera died, my uncle declared that I had been imagining things, despite the damaged property and missing clothing, and insisted on removing the camera from my property. Not even a week later, I was walking to my grandparents' house, which is a little more than 100 feet up the hill from my own house, because I had forgotten to lock their door and they rarely did so themselves. I was in their driveway when I saw something duck behind their porch. I rushed back down to my house, and I asked my mother to lock their door instead because I thought I had seen something. I didn't want to say that I had seen a person because by this point my uncle and grandparents had me have convinced that my mother and I really were just imagining things. But, no long story short, she had to chase a man in light-colored clothing off their property. She unfortunately didn't get a look at the man's face. On the bright side, he ran into a tree. That last incident happened in November, and my grandfather's friend died that December. The strange occurrences pretty much halted after that point, though the following year I heard a cell phone ring outside my window, someone broke into my uncle's truck and rummaged and my elderly neighbor had someone pacing her driveway during a power outage. Being from the city, and, before that, a railway town, I'm not exactly a stranger to creepy things happening at night or attempted break-ins, but there's something uniquely sinister when these things start happening in the middle of nowhere.
NoahtheRed says, born and raised in the heart of the Appalachians, Roanoke, Virginia. Honestly, the scariest experience was stumbling upon a grow-up with an active still. Like, these boys were in for a penny, in for a pound. It was just off 460 in Sawsville, maybe 3/4 of a mile up the tree line in a small holler. We came around the bend and the smell of the mash gave it away. We didn't see anyone, so we just turned around and headed off the road to try and avoid any attention. Maybe 100 down from there, we stumbled in a small clearing full of growing/immature marijuana plants. We knew better than to mess with that, so we quietly did our best to get out without making noise or shitting our pants. That was my first, and only, time running into a grow-up, but I definitely ran into more than my fair share of stills, active and abandoned, in Roanoke, Franklin, and Botetourt County. Frankly, I'd rather find a dead body than an active still.
JackJersBrainStoomz says, mine is a bit long but it's late now. But tomorrow I'll share my story of when I did a survival camp in East Tennessee. Okay, here's my story. TL/Doctor at the end. In May of 2003, I was fresh out of high school and had just joined the Marines. There was a period from when I joined until I could go to boot. So I took those few weeks to sign up for a survival camp. A local company in Gatlinburg offered survival techniques over a 10-day period. We met at the Elkmont campground in the Great Smoky Mountains with a group of 5 other survivalists and a group leader and his assistant. They would stay with us for 3 days and show us techniques. Things like setting up tents, identifying local flora and fauna that was edible, how to set traps, etc. Each of us were given a backpack with items that you may commonly carry when hiking: chapstick, binoculars, some protein bars, lighter, matches, and we were allowed one personal item. I brought a small hatchet as I knew what items was included in the backpack from the start. In case you didn't know, you can walk down the Elkmont Trail and you run into an abandoned town. It's an eerie place as it was a dreary day. The town was all but abandoned in 1992 when the leases expired and people living there left. There were a few people living there until 2001 when the last person left for good.
All the places are kept up by the NPS and they are all well preserved from the logging town it once was. So with approval by the NPS to use one of the buildings as base for the first few days we started our training. For 3 days, our group did several things. We used the Little Pigeon River to get water, which we liked boil for 15 minutes to kill anything in the water. There are a few natural springs in the area that you can drink fresh and the guides showed us these. We learned how to make lean-to, how to use rock walls to make shelter with fire heating it up to keep warm, how to build hammocks out of kudzu vines, what wild strawberries look like along with several other things. They did not show us mushrooms as these are easily misidentified so they don't chance that for legal reason but the puffball ones are the only ones they allowed us to pick as they are easily identifiable. We also made traps like snares and rock falls, along with making fishing line out of kudzu vines and makeshift hooks, or finding fish in quiet zones of the creek where you could trap trout. We learned how to make fire with binocular glass, matches and lighter and proper TP builds for you kindling. After the 3 days we were let go on our own. You would stay at base camp and the leader would walk you several miles into the undergrowth. Each of us were taken at different times and given a satellite radio in case we had an emergency. So we set off on our own and made the best of it. The group leaders would stay at base and wait 5 days then come get you. Day 1, nothing out of the ordinary. I set a few traps, built a decent lean-to on the side of a large boulder. Fire is doing a solid job of heating the rock wall to keep it pretty warm inside. The air was crisp, not quite cold, some drizzle but no deluges. I'm close enough to the river that I only need to walk 70 yards or so. I'm not quite up the mountains but on somewhat of a hill, surrounded by pawpaw, rhododendrons that are starting to bloom, catalpa and several conifers. I eat half of a protein bar and collected quite a few plants. First night is quiet, only hear a few things out in the forest. It's very dark outside the firelight. I've collected enough wood to keep any critters at bay. Namely black bears as they can be curious. I was awoken at some point in the night by the sat phone. Another survivalist is complaining about some large animal walking around his campground. Seems to believe it's a bear but it sounds like it's walking on 2 legs. Never says anything else the rest of the night. Night goes by without incident. I will say I did find tracks that looked human but were indicative of a Bigfoot as the footprint wasn't formed quite like ours. I wear a size 12 boot. This I put my foot into the print and it was a solid 5 longer. Now there are stories of the TN wildmen in this part of the country and several of the stories originated in Coke County which is just to the north of Sevier and Jefferson on the other side of the GSM. My grandfather owns a small cabin in Newport and has told me stories about him hunting and something following him. I brushed the stories off until I saw that print and from night 1 sat call. Night 3 is when everything went to shit. Around 1 a.m. is when I started question things when a large rock hit the back of my lean-to. I figured it was from the boulder and something simply broke off as rock slides are common around here. After that woke me up. I grabbed the flashlight and assessed the damage. I rolled the boulder off the shelter and it wasn't too far from breaking it completely. I half-assed fixed it and figured I'd just fix it in the morning. I had caught a rabbit in a snare and I cleaned it not far from camp. It'd say 100 yards off. I could hear noises from that area, but chalked it up to raccoons or a fox. I shined the light that way but saw nothing as the trees were too thick. Then something screamed. It sounded like a gorilla when it gets angry, followed by a chuffing sound. Like when a dog has drank too much water. That deep in the throat, like it's clearing it out. I stood there frozen in this tiny clearing thinking a bear is finishing off the entrails if the rabbit I cleaned earlier. I have no weapons other than my hatchet and a pocket knife. I come out of my trance and walk over to my backpack, never taking my eyes off the wood line. Everything in the night is quiet. I only hear the river running and the logs crackling. I sit down with my hatchet and throw more logs on the fire, hoping that it gets large and hit enough to keep thing at bay. I sit for maybe 30 minutes and am kind of dozing off, then another rock comes hurling from the left side of the forest and falls 10 yards away. I know the boulder didn't do this based on where this rock came from. Now I'm panicking. I stand up hoping to make myself look large with my shadow on the boulder behind me. I hear the chuffing again, and smaller trees further in are clearly moving back and forth rather quickly. I can see a large black shape moving around the firelight just at the edge of the end of the light. 40 yards in maybe. I can hear this thing breaking limbs, crushing leaves with every step. Thing was at least 8 feet tall if I had to guess. But it was pretty far away from where I was. It's slowly moving away, but I could tell where the thing's head was watching me, as every now and again it'd see I shine. The sounds started getting fainter and fainter. And I could hear it go into the river and cross it. That loud shush, shoosh sound from the water as it crossed were only a few steps. It was about 20 feet across the river at this point. I sat back down and contemplated what to do. It's around 2 a.m. and I have a few hours till daylight. I don't want to walk the 4 miles back to Elkmont in the dark in a place I'm not familiar with. Fast forward 2 hours, it's 4-ish a.m. The sat phone turns on and a guy is screaming into it, "Something is trying to kill me. I've had several ricks thrown at me. A large man is outside my shelter. I can hear it. This isn't a bear, I don't know what it is. But I need help." Silence. 15 minutes, 20 minutes go by, another guy comes on. "Something did that to me last night, but I thought it was a bear. I stayed here thinking I knew what it was. Rocks weren't thrown though, but I could hear it walking the perimeter of my camp." The guides must have awoken at this point, as the lead got on and said they can call the park service to come get everyone. But that would be hours, and it's better to stay put and make do. So I wait. It's close to 5 a.m. now. If I can make it a few hours until daylight, I'm fine. All the forest sounds have returned. I'm still waiting, and around 7:15 a.m. and I can see flashlights in the distance. Sun isn't quite up yet, but that eerie dawn light is filling the land. The clearing is still pretty dark. I start gathering my things and start putting the fire out with dirt around the pit. And by the time it's out, the rangers are there with me. One of them was older and was clearly of native Indian descent. He said there are stories of men in these woods that don't take to people living on their land. That tribes have always sought harmony with each other. I tried to ask more, but he said we do not talk of these men. We walked back to Elkmont and met the rest of the group. One guy was clearly shaken up, and I assumed he was the one yelling on the phone. He only said its teeth were like an ape's. That he can't get those teeth out of his head. I still go to the GSM often, as my parents live there. I still hike and camp, but I never go alone. Even as a former Marine and seeing some terrible things, I have never felt that primal fear as I did that night 17 years ago. That's my story of the time I did a survival camp and only lasted 3 days. If you ever venture out to Cades Cove, Tremont, or and of the many hiking trails, be wary that something may be watching you. TL/Dr. The TN Wildman made my life a living hell in the spring of 2003 in the Great Smoky Mountains.
Brancher says, "Fuck it, how about another one?" Back when I had just got my license, we would go camp up in the George Washington National Forest so we could drink a few beers underage and not get in trouble. It was me and my 2 brothers and another friend one night. We had a fire and played music loud and got drunk. They all wanted to go back down the road to this cabin because we saw on the drive-in there was what looked like a party going on, and we knew the cabin owner, so they went off in the dark walking to the cabin while I stayed back and tended the fire. Anyway, a few hours later, like 2 a.m., they all stumble back, and our one buddy is complaining that these people stole his cell phone and he wanted to go back to get it, but we told him we'll stop in the morning to look and to go to bed. So next morning we pack up and head out down the road to the cabin, and as I'm driving down the road, out of nowhere this dude flies out of the woods and starts beating on the hood of my truck. He was completely covered in blood. We all get out and we tell him to back up and try to figure out what is going on. This dude says the people in the cabin took his phone and beat the shit out of him. Not good situation. So we go down to the cabin because I wanted to see if the owners were there, but they were not. The people staying there were what we described back in the day as devil worshippers, back when the whole satanic panic was going on. Anyway, my buddy is frantically looking for his phone and the bloody guy comes down to the cabin, and this huge goth/grunge guy comes out of the cabin and just starts beating this guy with a log. I tell my buddy and my brothers we have to leave now, fuck your phone, and we got the hell out of there. I think we called 911 once we got back into service to tell them what we saw, but never knew what happened after we left.
Deleted says, camping out near Mills River NC. Me and my friend were camped along a service road on a primitive site. There were other sites, but they're quite spread out. It's a dirt road that connects two campgrounds over a long distance, not many people out there. Anyways, one night when we were camping we saw a truck pass by on the service road. It was like an old meat packing truck, dilapidated with all the labels torn off. It slowed down and came to nearly a complete stop by our campsite, then took off after checking us out. About 2 days later we learned someone had been kidnapping people and tying them to trees to starve, about a 20-minute hike from our campsite. Never found out if they were related, but still gives me the creeps.
SaturnaliaSacrifice says, where I used to live was in the south-central subregion of Appalachia. I had electricity and eventually internet, cell service, etc., but we lived right next to areas that didn't. During the county fair, which was a big to-do for the Tri-County area, we would see mountain people come down to sell meth. They would stand between the trailers on the outer rim after dark. It was free entry, so people slipped in and out with no issues.
Tabayo Okuma 1 says, alright, so I lived on a farm in/around the Appalachian Mountains as a kid. I don't have many stories, but I remember a few. It was around the time of year that coyotes are prominent, and we always tried to bring them in around 8 o'clock. My sister and I, somewhere around ages 9 and 12, ran out and called for them. We heard some kind of ungodly roar/scream in the distance. I know for a fact that it wasn't a pig, horse, donkey, chicken, pig, coyote, or dog. Bears aren't common around where we live. I had never seen one at my house growing up, but I had seen them at my aunt's house. I can't really describe it well, but it was a deep sound that was really loud. It sounded angry, honestly. The dogs barked at it. It wasn't coming from close to our house, probably from one of the fields, probably 2 football fields away. Either way, it was terrifying to young us, and we sprinted back inside. With the doggos, of course. We never heard the sound again, and to this day I sometimes wonder what it was.
Deleted says, well, I don't live in or even near the Appalachians, but in the year of 1998 I drove up there to pick up a pickup truck, 1994 Chevy S10 that was such a deal I couldn't pass it up. It was going to be my son's first car, that I found in a magazine ad. It was probably a 8 hours plus drive, and by the end I was pretty wiped. Soon I got off the highway, more like a 2-lane road, and onto an off-the-path but still paved road, but it had power lines so I wasn't scared, but then it turned into a dirt road, and then just a path with no hydro. I had the creeps at this point because the sun was going down, I was alone, and I was in the middle of some deep woods in the middle of nowhere, with no weapon, and I wasn't even in my own country anymore. I'm from Canada, but soon enough I reached the house, which was a 1-room cabin. At 10 p.m., I stopped my truck and knocked on the door, no response. So I knocked and waited for probably 10 minutes when I decided whatever, I'll just look around for the truck. There was no truck or even any cars here. I called the man from the ad who said I made a wrong turn about 40 miles ago and that I was in hillbilly country. He advised me to get my ass out of there ASAP. So I hopped into my truck and turned it on. A man appeared out of the woods dressed like a homeless man, smoking a cigarette, and yelled something like, "Get out of here, we don't like out-of-towners here," but I couldn't understand. He was mumbling and saying it so fast that all the words just melted together. He ran back into the woods, so I pulled out of the driveway and went on. About 2 minutes down the trail I noticed a ratty black Dodge pickup following me. I didn't think much of it at first, but this guy was driving dangerously, swerving, trying to pass me, etc. Suddenly my back window exploded, and there was little pellets all over my cabin. They shot my window out. I didn't know what to think, so I sped up and was being chased at 100 kilometers per hour, 60 miles for Americans, down the trail at 10:30 at night, dark as hell, but eventually they gave up and I got onto a more mainstream road. I called the person selling the truck and asked for directions there. He welcomed me into his home when I got there and gave me directions to the nearest body shop and hotel. In the end I got the S10, had to pay $900 for a window. That sucked, but I had my life, so that's what matters most.
Stark_TM says, my mom swears up and down that the church we went to when I was in elementary school had demons in it. I heard voices when there wasn't anyone but me and my mom there. Dad was the pastor, but that's a whole new story. Shit would move around, and the overnight fly infestation of Christmas Eve, 2011. That place is one of the main reasons why I'm not quite an atheist.
EagleVal63 says, so many stories to tell. I grew up in Southwest Virginia/Northeast Tennessee, and the area, or Southern Appalachia, is rich with folklore and scary stories, maybe more so than any other part of the country. This is due to the rich Scots-Irish culture, who brought stories over from Europe, and the Native Americans. My buddies and I used to go ghost bustin', as we called in, on weekends in college. Check out the books by Charles Edwin Price, they're available for cheap on Amazon. He was a local folklorist who collected many stories about the area before he passed away. I have most of them. They'll chill you to the bone.
Sailor_Raina says, grew up in western NY near the PA border, and hunting is really big there. Seriously. The first day of hunting, everyone skipped school just to go. Anyway, about 10 years ago my best friend and I were smoking and riding around on her four-wheeler, and behind her property was a big open space, so we were just cruising along, and from out of the tree line this big-ass redneck, like 65 guy, no teeth, scraggly gray beard and hair, was covered in blood and holding a deer's head by the antler in one hand and a shotgun in the other, stops us and tells us to turn the four-wheeler off so we can hear him, and he just says, if you little ladies come on my property again and scare away my game, your ass will be next. And with that we rode back as fast as we could to her house to tell her stepdad, and then he got on his four-wheeler and went to go find him, because apparently that field was owned by her stepdad's uncle or something, but couldn't find anything. Not the scariest thing, but when you're high, that made us almost shit our pants.
Panzramsnipple says, not a creepy experience, per se, because the creepiness only sets in after you've been living here a couple years. Town's 55 to 65% reservoir and nature reserve, which in effect means it's been artificially kept in a primitive state, never evolving a backbone or nucleating around a town center. Makes getting from one half to the other longitudinally an ordeal, and it's a populated enough area that gas or a cell signal isn't something you have to think about until you do. As an elder sibling, it has fallen to me to pick up brother's idiot friends who run out of gas driving to Dairy Queen. The radio cuts out predictably going around bends on the main roads, and when Google Maps Waze etc. can drop out on the way to a babysitting gig on an unfamiliar back road, you're reminded just how much your generation depends on an internet connection. The creepy factor comes from living somewhere your entire life and it being small enough to gossip about where's the best place to get a sandwich, and if the Five Guys 2 towns overpassed the health inspection at the market but spread out enough to make a round turn and realize there are miles of paved road you have never driven down, which ergo means you don't know anyone who lives down this way.
The Cook 187 says, went on my first solo deer hunt for the first time at 17. Used fox urine as a cover scent and had an unsuccessful hunt. It was pitch black as I hiked the mile-long trail back to my truck. I heard a pack of coyotes bark and howl not too close by. Well, they picked up the fox urine scent, and about every 1 to 2 minutes I could hear them barking closer and closer. Finally saw my truck about 50 yards away and the coyotes sounded about 100 to 200, and as I walked into the clearing a covey of doves, ATL East 30, flew out of a bush 5 feet to my left onto me. Needless to say, my heart dropped while almost pissing myself before running back to the truck.
Dan1101 says, one time a guy from the north came down and had a lot of unreasonable expectations.
Midwest_Gangster says, alright, I don't know if this is really what y'all are looking for, but here goes. And I should say I'm weirdly sensitive to like vibes or whatever. One time I was walking through like a gulch or whatever and I got a super bad feeling. 2 days later they found a body there. I was working on farm through Texas and then got a tip on one that was hiring outside of Mobile. So we packed up and head to Alabama. It was okay, the farm owner used to tell us Civil War ghost stories owned the fire. Anyways, so we head over to Jackson, Mississippi. We stop to get gas, and we're living in a camper on the back of my truck, and I ask the attendant, "Hey, do you know of anywhere to park where we can stay the night?" He looks at me, then my rig and then my girlfriend pumping the gas, then back to me and says, "Do you know where you are? You're in Jackson, Mississippi. Don't stay here. Leave." So I'm like, okay, that's weird, this guy's frigged, but whatever. So we start heading towards Memphis and we Google mapped a campground just before the Tennessee line. We ended up getting gas again, and this crew of real hicker kids pull up in a shitty bubble window style Ford Taurus and like 4 quads. Everyone gassed up and I go in to pay and the cashier says that crew of kids is up to no good. So I'm like, dude, Mississippi in general is frigged, I guess. It's been a way longer than expected drive and we get to this campground. There is only us and the campsite like maintenance guy or whatever staying there. And I just can't get the first guy's words out of my head, and the image of that hicker gang out of my head. But it's super late, I need to walk the dog. Hess a big black German shepherd and he doesn't frig owned, but Hess silent. I didn't even know he knew how to bark until months after I adopted him. Things are feeling super weird. I'm getting a very strange feeling. I'm walking the dog on the campground and get onto this trail and he stops. And I trust him. I always trust a dog before a person. It's just moonlight, but pretty dark. I know Hess locked into something. I say to him, "You feel that too, eh?" And he loses his GD mind and just starts barking like Hess yelling frig after whatever it is. So I turn around and Hess just walking backwards, face still in the direction of whatever he was barking at until get like a good 50 away and he finally calms down. Wake up to a foggy, frosty morning still with grim feelings, but I'm determined to make the best of it and start fresh with a positive attitude. Stay in Memphis, feeling alright. Then go to the Jim Beam Distillery in Kentucky. And I don't know if you've been there before, but that place is grim AF. Just massive black barns that could hold bourbon or witches or stacks of dead. Just couldn't shake the super grim feeling until we got to Pittsburgh. The South is weird, I mean nothing happened but it still just got me so shook.
Whaddayougonnado says, canoeing in North Georgia and seeing a man or two standing at the edge, watching you go by, and realizing they know you will be somewhere downstream.
thatDSMguy says, this happened near Winfield, BC at like 3 in the morning. My cousin and I were out and about one night and he had the urge to blow up an aerosol can for some reason, so we went to Walmart and got a can and a bottle of isopropyl alcohol. We drove up a mountain back road. It's a logging road that no one uses at night, I know it very well, and we stopped far away from any cabins. Anyway, we pull over, he puts the can in the middle of the road and pours the alcohol on it and lights it. Just as I expected, it didn't blow up, so I told him to drive over it. I stood outside to video it, and right after he drove over it, from behind me in the pitch black night, probably 20 feet, I hear this deep raspy male voice say, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I didn't even turn around to see what it was. I just dove through the window into the back seat of the car and yelled at my cousin to peel out of there. I have a video of it on Snapchat. You have to have the volume cranked and it cuts out right after "hey" because I let go of the record button as soon as I heard it. Scared the shit out of me.
MC_Freak 2013 says, heading towards Tennessee for a car show at about 4 a.m., somewhere between two mountains, we saw a bright flash of light come from the trees. It wasn't lightning and there were not any houses in the woods where it came from. I'm not much of a believer, but all I can think is aliens.
IHaveComeForMemes says, me and my brother own an auto shop called Grimer Brothers. We had this group of city folk come in and they wanted us to drive their cars down to Aintree. They was trying to canoe down the Kahulas River. They paid us $50 and we took their cars down to Aintree. They were some strange folks, alright, trying to paddle down the biggest river in the state.
ImInTheFutureAlso says, I'm from the Midwest, but I'm absolutely fascinated by Appalachian culture. I'm loving this thread. Thanks, everybody.
Baboshinu says. Southern Ohio, last year. Got lost driving back to my college, and almost shot right past my turn-off road. Sat there lightly dazed with only a dim greenish street lamp on a telephone pole in my headlights. I took a brief look down at my GPS and I heard a loud distinct screech. I don't believe in the paranormal a whole lot or anything, but I know I heard something, and it was something alive. I floored it and never looked back. I refuse to go on that road now and always take the long way from the highway.
letsgetsleepy says. When I moved in with my husband and his family I was terrified. Dark, scary mountain woods were bad enough, but to find out I could easily run into a bear or a bobcat was horrible. One night I'm half asleep when my husband starts gently shaking me and he says, "Do you hear the crying?" And sure enough I can hear crying outside our window. Sounded like toddlers and I have never been more scared. I asked him what the fuck is that and he laughs at me while letting me know that it's just bobcats talking to each other.
FlakeDondi says. Wow, I'm European and I must say I'm quite blown away by this. Thanks a lot for sharing. It's 1 a.m. here, was planning on sleeping, but I had to Google and look at pictures of the Appalachian mountain people. So interesting. The fact that they're so feral and separated from the society. Just wow. But why do they tend to be so unfriendly and violent?
Harley_Atom says. I found a wolf spider while walking outside in the dead of night. It was on the side of my grandma's house. I immediately went back inside. Did not mention it to anybody. I just pretended that I never saw it, took a melatonin, well maybe 2, and went to bed.
Crazy Ask Fort Lady says. Used to live in mid-upstate NY, near Albany. Lived on a farm, like everyone else, with 50 acres of land, most of which was woods. I'm not sure how close we were to the but still, middle of nowhere, tons of woods, just a bunch of farmers. At the time, 2008, a bunch of people had issues with sheep going missing. We didn't really know why, and it wasn't a huge deal, but quite a few of us had lost 1 or 2 sheep over the past month, I guess. One night, I went out to our barn, which was like a 3 or 4 minute walk from our front door, to close the chickens in for the night and make sure the pigs were fed. I honestly wasn't that scared at all because I was used to just taking a flashlight and walking around the property. My parents taught me how to deal with most wild animals I would encounter, and I had never had any issues. I was also 8 years old and obviously thought I was kinda invincible. I was locking the chickens in and about to head back inside when I heard this awful, primal scream. Sounded like a mourning mother or something. I got that primal, instinctual I'm in danger feeling. Turned my flashlight off and sprinted back to my house in the darkness. Next day, my mom and I were driving to a friend's. Mom gets a call from our next door neighbors, who in reality live like a mile away. They found the remains of one of their sheep up a tree, basically stripped to bone. Mountain lion. Mystery solved. I still think about it all the time. That scream sounded so close.
Deleted says. This gave me goosebumps. Super creepy. Thanks for taking the time to share them. Smile.
scootylewis says. Hearing a mountain lion scream. They sound like a deranged woman. Super unsettling.
Basiclobster says. There's a pretty popular trail where I live, part of the Appalachian in North Jersey, and I still can't explain what happened this one evening. My friend and I decided to take the 2-hour trek up to this spot to watch the fireworks, until we realized we went on the wrong day. Feeling dumb and defeated, we walked all the way back toward my house. We were almost back to the trail which connected to my neighborhood and was separated by the trail we were on by a field. It was getting late and the sun was setting quickly when we heard this animal screaming over our music. We looked at each other horrified, thinking it was a mountain lion, and ran for about 10 feet when I stopped, turned off my music and listened again. The inhuman screaming sound turned into what sounded like a woman singing or chanting in another language. Then a man's voice chimed in. We looked around frantically for people and couldn't see anyone or anything. We sprinted all the way home and decided to cut into town. As soon as I got near the grocery store is when I finally felt safe.
TerrorJunkie says, my hometown is the closest town to this graveyard and church. It's infamous for having a witch buried there. So when I was a teenager, my best friend hubby FM, his friend T, and I go camping out there. They have an official campground area, but we went past that and the church/graveyard to this spot where some people had made a group of camps, about 5 of them. We get there and set up. We notice that there is a camp set up in one of the spots already, but there is no one about. We only had my tent and I gave it up to A&M since they were dating and I was just going to sleep on a blanket by the fire with T. We had some drinks, swim in the lake, and so on. We all pass out at some point. I get woke up to M yelling out, T, are you up walking? And T says no, I've been asleep. At this point M pops out of the tent and says something's been walking around the campsite, so we all get up and pull our flashlights out. When M yelled out the sounds just stopped, nothing ran off at the noise. We go down to the other camp to see if there was anyone down there and no one was in the tent or anything. We searched the woods and our camp and all the way back to the car. Nothing. So we all lay back down and catch a few more hours. We get up the next morning and decide to check the other campsite out again. It's completely abandoned. We are talking expensive camping gear. The tent, multiple coolers, camp chairs, cookware, kids' lake floats, sleeping bags. Everything was left behind. We decide it's time to pack up and get back to town. Get the first load back to the car and find that one of the tires are flat. Great. We finish packing up and M says, F this shit, we are getting the hell out of here, flat or not. We had parked T's car at a general store before you even get to the official campground, so we make our way back there. Use T's spare on M's car and start back down the mountain. Well, I rode with T back and we get 3/4 back down the mountain. When his car is almost out of gas, it doesn't make it all the way down. So M has to go get gas. We are back in town, but over the next few days the other 3 tires on M's car go flat, and 2 on T's. I only went back once and it was the last. I won't go back again, not even just a drive. Too many stories and experiences in that area. I don't know what exactly is out there, but I don't care to find out.